Welcome to Name 3 Songs. I'm Sara Feigin.
And I'm Jenna Million. And this is a podcast where we take the piss and debunk music fan stereotypes because, let's be honest, fangirls knew about that band way before you did.
And if you stick around long enough, we'll also let you in on some new music the girls are already crazy about.
So today we are continuing our discussion about One Direction. And I'm really excited to dive into this topic. As we mentioned in our last episode, we could do a whole podcast just about what happened with One Direction and where they are now. But we're going to attempt to break some of that down today. We're mostly focusing on how the media portrayed this and how the media talked to them as a boy band and then as individuals in their solo careers.
And we are very aware that One Direction has always talked very positively about their fan base, even though the media has always tried to get them to say mean things about the fangirls who love them so dearly. And so we thought that a good place to start this episode before we dive into like our own opinions on how things were handled and just our thoughts on interviews that they've done as solo artists. We thought it would be nice to discuss with you guys some fans who filled out our survey asking what their thoughts were on whether or not the media handled the One Direction hiatus well. So Jenna, would you like to jump in? Because I know you had some thoughts on the responses that we got.
Yeah, definitely. When their hiatus was announced, Zayn had already left the band a few months prior, and they kind of like they put out the Drag Me Down single and announced the album, and then like 2 days later or something they also announced the hiatus, right, Sara?
Yeah. It was like a very quick
and
it was the Drag Me Down video, then 2 days later they announced the hiatus, and then exactly a month after the hiatus announcement they announced that they were releasing their final record on their contract.
So there was just a lot happening already when they were trying to promote this album. So Eliza, thank you for filling out our survey. I'm going to read something that you wrote for us. The press tour was marred with questions about both topics. She means the hiatus and like Zayn leaving, almost eclipsing the talk of the album itself that was due to drop shortly after. Even without a tour lined up afterward, the album deserved to be spoken about, especially considering the vast percentage of songs that minimum one of the members had written on, if that made sense. At least one of the members had written each song on that album.
Yeah.
So yeah, to that point, the album was kind of overlooked because of everything else that was happening. So it didn't really get the praise that it could have if this other stuff was not going on.
Yeah. And I think that that's important. And I like touched on this briefly in the previous episode, but like when you watch the video interviews that they were doing, like they still were just either getting the same dumb questions or like, oh, like why'd you decide to do the hiatus? And it's like, you could already tell just from like concerts that the boys were trying to prove that they were more than just a boy band, with like Niall bringing out his guitar and like all that sort of stuff. And so the fact that this was a record that they all had like more like their hands were way deeper into the pot of like the creation of it, and that they weren't asked about it or like allowed to really talk about it that much, I think was a disservice to them as talented people. And I think again, once we go into like interviews that they did afterwards, even though most of the interviewers like seem to take that, at least that we're going to be talking about, seem to take the boys pretty seriously, you can still tell that there's just like that boy band stigma of like, do they really know what they're doing?
So some more quotes that we got. Clara, I hope I'm saying your name right. You made the point that a lot of the headlines were like One Direction calls it quits, rather than four young guys who have worked their asses off want a break. And so it's kind of like they were like basically the biggest boy band we've ever seen up at that point, because we're not going to talk about BTS. That's another discussion. But at this point, they were the biggest boy band in the world. They were so massive. They were a household name.
I mean, they had a number
they've
one
been doing this
album before like the Beatles did. Like they just were like so much more successful than their predecessors who people compare them to, and it's just crazy.
And they had worked so hard for these 5 years. If you think just constantly, they did 5 albums, they did 4 tours, like they never had time off. Like they were working insane amount. And it honestly just doesn't seem sustainable. Like that was never going to be sustainable. There was always going to be a break. Like they were never going to be One Direction for their whole lives.
Yeah.
And then also one more quote from Marissa. I don't think it got nearly enough attention. One of the biggest bands in the world taking a break during a peak in their careers should have launched an exploration into why they would make such a shocking choice and how the industry treats its artists. But instead, it was just clips of girls crying and making fun of fans for being heartbroken.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about this when we were episode planning, but again, like just from my work experience, like unfortunately, the management and like PR teams and all of that have like a way bigger stake in things than like the average music listener realizes. And so if a music journalist at the height of the hiatus had been like, yeah, I'm going to do a deep dive on why this is happening, like they could have just been blacklisted from anything that those teams ever did ever again. And it's something that I think at some point in the next 5 years we'll probably have a documentary on like why this happened, because it's necessary, I think, to discuss it, because it seems like there was some shady business going about. So I think that Marissa's point is really important, and I think that it's really great that the fans noticed that that was something that wasn't discussed, because I think that that means that at some point it will be able to actually be discussed.
Yeah, and I think what you just said also, it's like media too, they're like, they don't take the fans seriously, and yet like we know what's going on. Like we know management put them in these positions. That's why we're having this conversation right now. Mm-hmm. And it's just like another instance of the fangirl stigma of downplaying like the opinions, the all of that, the smarts of the fangirls themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, I think just going off this and sort of going into like how we were talking about how like Zayn didn't really have time to like create his own image. I think that it's really clear that management had a lot of control over the guys, because the second that Harry was on his own, like Harry became Harry. And like it was so clear that like he wasn't really allowed to like discover himself while in the group, because his shift from being like this teen boy who dressed like he was trying to be in an indie band to dressing like a 70s pop icon and just like having all this personality and all like this charisma and all this stuff. And I mean, obviously it was clear before this that he had charisma and personality and all that stuff, but he was really finally free and like allowed to shine. And it's never been so clear to me, other than like Lance Bass having to hide the fact that he was gay the whole time he was in NSYNC, that like management has so much control over you. And like Harry becoming solo and getting away from modest management and like becoming his own thing and just being like, look at me, like this is who I am, like this is what I love. I just think that that's really sad, but also really powerful, that he kind of was just like, hi, I'm here, here's Kiwi.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this, and I think it's important to note like the ages. When One Direction started, they were teenagers. They were like between 15? The ages of like 16 and 19. Yeah. And they were in it for 5 years. And that time period of your life, from like your teenagers to your early 20s, is like you grow so much as a person. Mm-hmm. You're learning so much about yourself. You're interacting with others in the world. And they were in a very controlled environment. They were told exactly what to do, where to be, how to dress, how to act. They were given those character roles that we talked about also in the last episode. And so their identity as individuals for the longest time was One Direction. Yeah. So it's like when they broke up, when they went on hiatus, when One Direction finished its 5-album contract, they all had to take time to figure out who they were as individuals. Yeah. And what they wanted to do after that, like if they wanted to make music and what their sound was. So that's definitely what we're going to dive into more in this episode.
Yeah, and I think that it's like really clear that like it kind of messed with some of them more than others, because I think that like just opinion based, but like Niall and Harry have had the most like clear cut success from becoming solo, like other than Zayn. But Niall clearly knew what he wanted to do, and Harry clearly knew what he wanted to do. And I feel like, at least in my opinion, like Liam was so like stuck in what One Direction made him be, which was like the fatherly figure of the group, like the one that's in control of this whole thing, and like also going from being like who they chose as like the front man, like who their team chose to be the front man at the beginning, and then Harry like slowly outshining him, honestly, like throughout One Direction's career. And then I think that Liam kind of had like an existential crisis, because I mean, for a while he just was like fuckboy on Instagram. And then his music is fuckboy music. So
yeah, no, I think he definitely had the hardest time out of anyone. I read quite a few interviews with him, both kind of interviews surrounding his 2019 release of LP1.
Yeah.
And he talks about like, he's kind of open now about talking about the fact that like he had to go to therapy, like he was drinking a lot before, and like was depressed and like considered like, there's a quote from him. He made headlines for telling Aunt Middleton on the pair's Sky One show that the loneliness of fame had, quote, almost nearly killed him. And when Middleton asked Payne if he had ever wanted to act on those feelings, he said 100%. And so he clearly handled like fame and just everything in a very different way than like Niall, for example, who's very open in his interviews about how like he's pretty happy-go-lucky, and people will bring that up in interviews, and he was like, yeah, that's kind of just how I am, and like that's how my brain works, and I'm just happy to be here. And like very, very different ends of the spectrum of how they handled this. But I think all of them, like, I don't think that Harry and Niall knew what they wanted to be doing. Like, I don't think that whatsoever. It like there's interviews talking about Niall went backpacking with like his cousins or friends or something in Southeast Asia for a few months. I'm like, first of all, can you imagine backpacking in Southeast Asia and you just happen to be staying at the same hostel as Niall Horan post One Direction? Like, what? I read that and I was tripping out. But number two, even Harry Styles, like them taking time off, figuring out who they are, and then just like not being around people as much, of like that constant, the highs and lows of tour, the highs and lows of being that famous, being the biggest boy band in the world. When they go home, like who are they when they go home? And Harry's talked about in interviews of he kind of separates himself a bit of like his personal life and his work, and there's like kind of an air of mystery, and he says like, I don't do it for the mystery, I do it for like my peace of mind of having that, like I need to be someone outside of the limelight too.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important. And I just meant that I felt like Harry and Niall knew more about like what they wanted to do, mostly because I think that I feel like Louis knew if he was going to make solo music what he would make, but I think that like Niall and Harry have always been like knew what music they liked. And so they sort of knew what route they would take in that sense. There's been the conversation with Louis in multiple interviews about how like he at first was talking about maybe managing a girl group, and then how he started a record label as like an offshoot of Psycho that like he didn't wind up doing anything with. But I mean, most fans know that Louis has like a very weird relationship with Psycho, and like nobody knows what it is. I'm sure at some point he'll inform us. But the thing that I found really interesting was that a producer, Jeff Basker, who worked with Harry Styles on his debut album, said about Harry that he said that like the album was like a very different from what he'd expected from him, and that it made him realize that like Harry Styles in One Direction was like a quote digitized, like a kind of digitized Harry, almost like a character. I don't think people know a lot of the sides of him that are on this album. You put it on and people are like, wait, this is Harry Styles, which I think was a very large part of the conversation when Harry's first record came out. And I think that that's really interesting, and also something that I think we're all aware of, that like we don't really know Harry. Like we know what he gives us, and personally, as somebody who thinks that like social media is a bit exhausting, and like how accessible artists are nowadays can be hard for all of us, because it's like you're always waiting and hoping that they're going to tweet you or like DM you back or whatever the case is. And I think that Harry's like separation between Harry Styles the musician and Harry Styles the boy from Chester, England, are like is very like admirable, and something that other artists should, I think, take in stride.
Yeah, he's definitely, out of all of them, he's definitely come the farthest as far as expressing himself in his music, his clothes, fashion, all of that. And I think you mentioned Niall also has like a very defined, now he has a very defined kind of like who he is outside of One Direction. Yeah. So they are definitely the two best examples of that. I'm very partial to Harry, so I feel like my opinions kind of skew that way. But I can read some quotes that we also got from our survey, because they do touch on Harry.
Yeah.
So we asked people, do you think they were not taken seriously as seriously as solo artists because of being in One Direction? And it seems like the consensus was at first, definitely. And I think now that Harry's on his second album, he's been able to be just Harry at this point and not Harry from One Direction. But I do have some quotes here. Sabrina says, people were surprised to find out that Harry just now got his first #1 with Billboard #1 with Watermelon Sugar, considering how big he seems to be. But she says he thinks he's extremely underrated, and she's begged her friends to listen to Harry's music because he's, quote, not the same guy from One Direction. Yeah. And people aren't realizing that until now. Which like we've talked about the whole TikTok trend of like suddenly dudes have heard Harry Styles on TikTok and they're like, oh, Harry's music is good. And it's like, yo, Harry's been good for a minute.
Yeah, but also the thing on top of that is like from discovering that Harry's good, now these boys who probably bullied most of us like when we were younger about loving One Direction are now like revisiting One Direction and being like, oh, this is good. And it's like, as Louis said, if it's a banger, he wrote it. And it's just like, yeah, of course there are like good One Direction songs, because not at all times is it a room full of 40-year-old men just writing music. Sometimes it's like Louis and Harry, sometimes it's Niall and Louis, sometimes it's just Liam in a room writing a song. Like, it's not, every single song is not just written by old men for a boy band. It's like these guys collaborated with each other, they wrote stuff themselves, and then it turned into a collaboration. Like, it was way more than just like a stereotypical boy band like factory when it came to One Direction, especially later on in their like timeline of albums. And so it's just that weird scenario of people writing someone off because they were in a boy band or because at one point they created music specifically for girls. Like, the narrative around Taylor Swift releasing Folklore was also just like, oh wow, like Taylor Swift released an indie album. And I'm like, personally, I'm not a huge fan of Taylor Swift, but I'm like, almost every Taylor Swift album's been like an emo record, so I don't know where you've been. Like, it's like the second that somebody like quote unquote acceptable does a cover of a Taylor Swift song or like a cover of a One Direction song, then it's like, oh wow, this song's really good. And then you find out it's a cover of a Taylor Swift song and you're like, oh, maybe what? I didn't say that. Oh my God. What?
Yeah. It's judging people for being pop. Yeah. So here's another quote from Eliza. Harry Styles' first album, self-titled, was obliterated by critics, seen as a boy band member who was poorly executing a solo career purely based off the fact that he didn't release a radio-friendly pop record straight out of the gate, and because the narrative of him being the Justin Timberlake of the band was already woven. I think this is super interesting because it is true. His first record is this very weird rock, vintage, who knows what. And
perfection is the word you're looking for, Jenna.
Yes. Thank you. No, I'm a fan of it. I'm not dissing Harry. No, but I know, it's but not like, what people expected from him.
It's perfection. That's the word you're looking for.
There we go. It's not what people expected of him, especially as Eliza said, being compared to like the Justin Timberlake of the band.
Which I
and I
find
think that
wild.
kind of goes back to our whole thing.
Yeah.
Well, it goes back to our whole thing of just painting them as a pretty shiny candy pop boy band. This is what you're going to be even post band as a solo artist. And Harry's like, no, I'm so much more than that.
Yeah, and like the thing that I find interesting, and I think I slightly mentioned this in our one of our fangirl episodes, is that like Justin Timberlake, in my mind, did that thing where he left a boy band and was like, I'm gonna make a bunch of like I'm gonna tell the people who are writing my songs that I want my album to be proving to everybody that I can fuck, I can get down. And I feel like at no point, and that's the other thing is like they like the media and people always were like Harry Styles is a womanizer, and I'm like, he's a teenage boy. Like, I'm sorry, I've never understood like that narrative around Harry. It makes no sense to me because he's always just seemed like a pure wholesome child to me. Like my whole thing with Harry Styles was always like he must be protected at all costs, like he's too good for this world. But like Zayn and Liam, especially towards the end with like of their thing with Liam, like Liam was trying to be sexy, and like Zayn's whole thing when he left was like, oh, a mysterious bad boy, whatever. Like they both, to me, spark more of a Justin Timberlake narrative than Harry Styles ever did. And so the fact that the media was trying to weave Harry Styles into like the Justin Timberlake, and I guess they're just using that because Justin was the one who like successfully went solo, but still I'm just like, it just belittles what Harry is, and it feels like these people never ever understood him, which is like they were around for 5 years. Like there were interviews, like Harry talked about music he liked and stuff that he was interested in, and it's just it's so clear that they just never listened. And so it's just that, again, the whole thing of like the media being like, we've decided a narrative for you, this is how we're going to talk to you, this is how we're going to talk about you, and having that understanding. And I just think it's really interesting because when you do read interviews with these certain artists, like with these 4 members, like the way that the interviewers talk to each of them is very different, except for Rob Sheffield from Rolling Stone magazine. But Rob has always been like a fan of One Direction. He's never been ashamed of it. He's always just been like, there's nothing wrong with liking something that might not be created specifically for me. But when you read, like he did the most recent cover story with Harry, and then he also did the Louis Tomlinson like first interview about Walls, and just like the way that he converses with them, and like he does bring up One Direction, but he brings up One Direction in a way that's like very respectful of the fact that they were in the band. And he'll like like when he's talking to Louis, he like acknowledges that like Louis wrote no Control, which is like a freaking great One Direction song, and he acknowledges that it's kind of like a pop rock song compared to other stuff. And so he's acknowledging their skill set compared to how other interviewers are just kind of like trying to get something out of them, or like just continuously using the narrative of like this was their persona when they were in the band. And so it's just a really interesting like juxtaposition of how people talk to them and like how they're perceived.
Yeah, it's also interesting now that we are 5 years down the road from that, because so like Liam only put out his first record in 2019, and Harry's now on his second record. And I think Harry now, people are really starting to pay attention to him. The media is paying attention to him and giving him a serious fighting chance. And Niall's also on his second record as well this year. And the interviews I read with Niall, they're much, 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 much more considerate of who these people are as individuals. Kind of that self-exploration period, and talking to them like on a deeper level. And part of it is the boy band thing. I think part of it is they were so young. Part of it is they were so groomed by management, and the fact that they were always interviewed together. There's never like one-on-one One Direction interviews. And part of that is because they're an entity. They're not individuals. And now that they are doing their solo things, they have a chance to be this. And I mean, there's like the Zane Lowe video interview with Harry Styles. It's like very in-depth, and they talk about everything. They talk about One Direction, they talk about his new stuff and the Rolling Stone stuff as well. Like, I think now they're finally starting to be taken seriously as individuals.
Well, I think also it's a lot easier for people who might not have been fans of One Direction or cared that much to separate them once they're on their second album cycle, which means that they've done at least like 4 press tour cycles. So they know them as humans more than as members of a boy band. So I think that that also has like is part of why it's easier now to like read an interview that's like not doesn't make you roll your eyes as often, or like watch an interview, wherever the case is. I mean, Niall, especially throughout like the first like 3 months of like coronavirus lockdown, like he was doing press all the time, and you could just tell, like, I mean, he's always had like a very laid back like persona around press, but you could just tell how comfortable he is within himself and his music, and he'll just talk and chat, and like every interviewer seems like they're his best friend. And it's just like it shows how like incredible of a person Niall is, but just also how much he's like, they know me, like they know who I am now. But I think the thing that frustrated me going back and like rereading a lot of these interviews, like comparing like 2017 interviews from like when they first started releasing solo stuff to like 2020, like late 2019 interviews, is that they're still asking these guys like, oh, like, do you still talk to the boys of One Direction? And they don't even do it where like it makes sense. They'll just like fully make that like a portion of the interview, because a few of these interviews are written in like the Q&A style rather than like a feature style. And it's like they took the time out to be like, I'm going to fully 180 this conversation and we're going to talk about One Direction. And I don't think, like, I think that there's a way to fit the question in a way of like, oh, like you maybe released a single and around when like your old boy band mate like released a single, like do you guys still catch up? Like how was, like what was that like there's a way to do it that's not clearly being like, oh, I'm just talking to you because I want One Direction information.
It's honestly ludicrous. 5 years down the road, they're still being asked, do you talk to the other boys? What's the beef? Like they're still trying to make this a thing, and it's just not a thing, and it doesn't need to be talked about anymore. And to our point of like, you can have friends, you can be doing something that was like a very like distinct period of your life and build those friendships, and years down the road you're not in that period of your life anymore, but that doesn't mean they're not your friends. And it doesn't mean like just because you don't talk every day doesn't mean, like you said, that they won't be there for you when you need them. And so I think it's they're really just like, the media is just pushing this like, but what about One Direction? And it's like, come on, like they have their own lives now. Like it's okay that they don't talk to each other every single day. Like it's okay they maybe even haven't seen each other in person in years, but that doesn't discredit anything that they did together. And I think the 4 of them have all said multiple times that like they still respect each other, respect what each other's doing. So like, I mean, it still stands. I mean, I just think, it's tired. It's a tired question. We need to move beyond this.
Well, the thing that I really enjoyed, so the more you guys listen to this, the more you will know that even though I outwardly read as a Harry Styles #1 fan, I am actually a diehard Louis Tomlinson fan. He means everything to my whole life. He did like a string of interviews promoting Walls like in February. So like literally like he was pumped up for tour. So like pre-corona, but he talked to The Independent, which is like a British newspaper online media outlet. And the 2 things that really struck me from the interview was that, #1, the way that the interviewer talks about him, so like this is written in like a feature story way, not in a Q&A way. She talks about him like he's like a true artist and not as if he's like a boy band member, although like later on she does she mentions One Direction, like it's not ignored, but she just like acknowledges like his taste in music and like how he's easy to talk to and like him as a person. Like she just talks about him in that way. But the thing, And the thing that just showed to me again, like how different interviewers handle things very differently is like she asked like, oh, like, are you still talking to the boys? And he just kind of completely skims over Zayn. Like he is like, oh yeah, like I talked to like Liam on the phone recently, like Niall and I text, like Harry texted me like a couple weeks ago when like my first single came out or something along those lines, but he just like skims over Zayn and she doesn't push it. And I think that that's really important because there are going to be interviewers like that asshole from GQ in 2013 who are going to be like, why'd you not mention Zayn? Like, what's going on there? Like, and I just don't think it's really that necessary to bring up. But I think that it's just really cool that even though this is Louis's first real big like press tour, because it's his first full length album that he's released since the hiatus like started in 2016, I think that it's really incredible that like he in almost all these interviews is like given the chance to just be Louis, even though like obviously they still have to use a decent amount of One Direction stuff because there haven't been a ton of interviews. But I mean the sad thing is when they do talk about One Direction, it feels like Liam and Louis both were kind of like the band. I wasn't ready for the band to end. Like I was not prepared for it. I finally felt like we were hitting our stride because they were letting us like have more input and do all these things. And it's really hard to read that as somebody who is a fan and who could tell that they were exhausted, but that they felt like they should have like that some of them felt like there might have been need to continue, or like maybe they don't feel like a whole person without it. But I think anything that is so big, such a big part of like formative years of your life, once it goes away, you kind of feel empty. And I mean, it's just, I've never been in a boy band, but I mean, I lived in England for my formative years. Like I went to university there, and like every day I feel like there's a part of me missing because I'm not a British person, but that's like how my brain functions. And so it's just like this weird thing where you read something that has nothing to do with you, and I'm like, oh, I get what you're saying. I totally understand what you mean.
So I think it's important, like in this interview you're talking about with Louis, he also talks about kind of his confidence as like a boy band member over the years. And like he said the initial 18 months were hard as he struggled to see his value in the band. And he says he would wonder what's the difference, what the difference would be if I was there or not. Which like emo heart hurts, like I know, sad about Louis saying that. But then he goes on to talk about how through songwriting he found his place and his confidence, and he was writing credits on 37 One Direction songs, more than anyone else in the band. And he says, quote, "That's something I'm really fucking proud of. Now I can say I make a difference." That fact is incredible. I mean, to be honest, I did not know this earlier, but like that just goes to show how they never talked about this when they were One Direction as a band. Like
they didn't take them seriously.
About like that growth. Yeah, that growth, like being able to do that. And now that they're solo, like he's having this interview about actually you as a songwriter, Louis as a songwriter.
Yeah. And so it's just that really interesting like juxtaposition of how for 5 whole years they just never were like, what's the writing process like for you guys? Like, what's this, what's that? And I'm just like, I don't get it. Like, I just don't understand how there was never an interviewer who was like, I'm gonna try and get real information out of them. Like, it just hurts me, especially because like they were friends with like some of these interviewers, like Nick Grimshaw and stuff like that. And I feel like even then, like when they would go on the radio and have these things, it was still trying to be like, who are you dating? What are you doing? And it's like, dude, ask them who wrote Girl Almighty. Like, I want facts. I don't want this like dumb stuff that doesn't affect me because I'm in America and I'm never gonna get to date Louis Tomlinson. Like, shut up.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting, like comparing these like more recent interviews to the 2019 interviews with Liam Payne and his the Billboard interview 2019 for LP1. He says going from being a soft pop rock band, which IMO, questionable description, and also the weight of One Direction success on top of you and working with a new team and label, it was difficult to know if people were all right with me moving into the hip hop lane with his new single, Strip That Down. Let him loose a little bit and push the boundaries as much as he could. I think he's just like it just seems like this and his LP1, he's just like pandering. He just like doesn't know what he's doing. And it took him they talk about how like it took him 3 years to do this, and it feels like he's lost. It feels like he doesn't know what he's doing with that One Direction. He's trying to find his sound. And I mean, of course there's a period of trying to find your sound and like not knowing what the next thing is, but he feels lost more than the others.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's a thing that has always struck me with like Liam, is that like it just felt like I was fully expecting to wake up one day with like some Lindsay Lohan-esque headline of like, ex-boy band star completely loses it at a nightclub, punches someone in the face. Like, that just felt like the path that Liam was going down with all of his like weird thirst trap Instagram posts, and then starting to date Cheryl and like all of those things. It just felt like he was spiraling and trying to figure out who he was in a way that like wasn't good for himself. And I feel like in most of these interviews he admits that. Like, even when he like got interviewed by Attitude magazine in like 2015, so like right after, like not even, they were still in a boy band, like he was talking about like how he was drinking a lot because he knew that this was coming and like all of this stuff. And it's like he's just never had great coping mechanisms. But again, when you start being in a boy band at such a young age, and he had wanted it for so long, like this wasn't the first time that he was on X Factor. And like the year before, I think it was the year before, maybe 2 years before, he was like 14 and like made it to the judges' houses. So like he's known for a while that like he wanted to be a singer.
Yeah.
And I think that like when you're in a boy band, and again, like they create this persona for you and you kind of grow out of it, because he did, like he wasn't like at the beginning, like he very much was just like this very like straight-laced boy, but like you could tell as he was getting older, like he didn't fit into the management persona he was given. And like they didn't let him escape it. Like they weren't like, okay, you can like it be something else. They were just like, no, this is what we want you to do. And so I feel like when that happens, like when you leave, there's bound to be a situation like he's in where he just seems really lost and seems like, okay, well, I like listening to hip hop, so that's what I'm gonna do, when like maybe that's not really what like the road he should be taking. I mean, I'm not like a specialist on this sort of thing, and I don't know Liam. And I mean, I liked Strip That Down, but like LP1 got lambasted by critics, and I mean, I listened to it and I think I might have laughed a few times because it just felt like he was doing that Justin Timberlake thing and not in a good way. Like the whole like, yeah, I have sex. Like there's literally a song that like fans are mad about because he was like talking about like hooking up with like a bisexual girl and like how that could mean like he would get a threesome. And then there was like another song about like him having sex in the backseat of a car, which like could either have been about sex in the backseat of a car or like sex in the backseat of a car, if you know what I mean. And so it's just like this really weird thing because like I worry about him, and I don't know him, but like you just like read these interviews and stuff, and like it's not even how these people are talking to him, but it's just knowing that he would rather, like it just seems like journalists who get to speak with him know that he would rather talk about his time in One Direction than talk about what he's doing right now. Like that always seems like what's happening.
Sarah, what were you saying about him doing a live show the other day?
Oh yeah, so it was the second one, so he twice has done like, and this is honestly incredible, and I'm very impressed with him, is because he's given like multiple live production people who have been out of a job for months the opportunity to make some money and do something cool. But he has done 2 live show performances that fans can buy tickets for, and it's like he's performing to an empty venue, I think in London somewhere, and he's doing all these songs. And I don't know what the first one was, but in the most recent one, he released the set list for this show like early, and on the set list was the One Direction song What a Feeling, which was on Made in the AM, which means it was never performed live. And so he solo performed that song live like for fans. And I mean, fans on TikTok were like losing their minds about the fact that this was going to happen. And then on Twitter afterwards, like the video was going around and all these people were like, oh my God, like this is so incredible and all of that. And so, I mean, he knows what One Direction fans want, and he's I think he's finally sort of realizing that like he doesn't have to be this like sexualized person. I think he's had a lot of inner thinking while being in a quarantine pandemic, being in the like living through a pandemic. It seems like he's just like had a lot of thought about what's going on, and he's like, okay, my fans don't like what I'm doing. I need to sort of change it a bit. At least in my opinion. I feel like people are going to get really mad at me about everything I'm saying about Liam. I'm really sorry.
I think he's still trying to figure himself out.
But I think he has time. He's talented. He's smart. He cares about his fans. Like, I think that if it takes him like another album to figure out what he's doing, I don't think anyone's going to go anywhere.
Yeah. So speaking of another album, so Niall, I did listen to Niall's most recent album, which like honestly, I've said this, I pretty much only pay attention to Harry these days.
Yeah.
So yeah, that one, the new one. And because I've just thought he was like doing country stuff, and like he was for a while, but this album, like when I read the interview with him, might be the Independent, I think, because it's a 2020, it was like about his album. They're talking about like, oh, here it is. They're talking about his new music is inspired by Fleetwood Mac, but also the Kooks. He's a diehard Shania Twain fan.
Oh my God,
and she returns the compliment. And recently, okay, blah, blah, blah. So he's talking about how he's kind of leaning more this like indie rock vibe. So it's like, all right, I'll give this record a fair chance. And it is like he is going a bit more of that indie rocker thing, which I think is cool, but it's still a very polished, very pop version of that. But it's kind of nice to see he's discovering himself as a solo artist.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that is kind of in the same vein. So you guys will have heard my music meltdown on Wednesday about my opinions and my love for Louis Tomlinson. So I think it's in the same vein of that, like Niall was doing some like his first album was something that he was like, this is like how I'm going to show what I'm doing, and then after that I can like focus more on making music of similar to what I listen to. And I think that he created kind of like a Brit pop indie album with like his sophomore album, and I feel like that's in the similar vein of like Louis' album, which is like very Brit pop leaning towards indie. And so I like that they're all kind of just like, we're British, we're just gonna own
it. I'll argue with you on the Brit pop point, but they tried.
No, that's what I'm saying. They're trying. They're like not reaching it, but they're like, we're gonna do this as best we can while like still not going full on 90s.
Yeah, I think so. On there also, there's like them wanting to live up to this, like the fame of One Direction. Like, are they good enough as solo artists? And then the other half of that has left my brain. So there's that one point for you.
No, but I think that that's really true. Is like they're trying to live up to it, and I think that in a lot of interviews with Louis, he was talking about how he wasn't even sure if he was gonna make solo music, and how he felt like this push to do that song with Steve Aoki because he just was like, oh, everybody else is releasing stuff. Like, I'm not gonna pass up the opportunity to work with like this really incredible man. And so I just think that it's really interesting.
It seems like, so I think my point was, it seems like they were all scared to release music individually.
Yeah.
And I think we talk about this with Louis, but like to different degrees, they're scared to release things that is so different from One Direction music because they think their fans won't follow them, which is just completely not true. Because if you're a diehard fan, you will follow them no matter what. Yeah. But like we talked with Harry, like he did not come out with some pop bangers. Like, I mean, they're pop bangers in his own way, but like not what the media expected of him. And same with Louis Tomlinson. We talk about how we want an absolute Brit pop, like punk rock record from Louis Tomlinson, and it's very pop leaning. And I think they're scared about going too far away from just being pop artists, that they'll be rejected in some way, not live up to One Direction's name.
Yeah, and I think like the one member that really got the most flack about all this, like in even just like in these interviews, once going solo and stuff, is like Louis got a lot of flack, especially for being somebody who acknowledged that he felt like he was like understated in the band and like didn't really know where he stood. But like in his first solo interview, which was with The Guardian in 2017, like the article literally starts with being like, oh, like there's always one member of like a boy band who comes out on top, and then there'll be other ones that like undershine them but like eventually like go somewhere. And like the journalist like in this wrote that Louis was ranked last in any serious analysis, the most fitfully appreciated member of One Direction. Oh, sorry, hold on, that didn't make any sense. So like Louis was always like rated last is what they were saying, and they were saying here is a combatant you might expect to find curled up in a foxhole on the battlefield, pale and chain smoking, and wondering how much he really wanted in on such an unequal fight. And like it's just like
that's a very unfair narrative of him,
especially
like
because
unfair
like
picture of him.
As the band grew, like Louis' voice was not super strong when we started, again something I mentioned in the Music Meltdown on Wednesday, but like his ability to work with harmonies, and then his songwriting ability, and then later on as his voice got stronger, his solos in the songs were ones that always stood out because his voice is very different. Like it stands out from the rest of the band, and not in a bad way, and just like a very specific to him kind of way that I think is really necessary in boy bands to have voices that can stand out. And so I just feel like the narrative around him when they first started was always like, oh, like he's the runt of the litter. And I don't think that was fair. And I might be biased because he's my favorite, but like it's just crazy that like he fully just was like, he didn't think about having a solo career and was like, oh, like maybe like he wound up like being a judge on X Factor for a little while and like doing all these other things and like making all these other plans, and then finally was like, you know what, I'm gonna work on my album and I'm gonna make something that makes me happy. And he did.
We love Louis.
Yeah, so it's just like it's just an interesting take, and I just feel like again we could talk about this band for hours because there's so much conversation about them in media, and like their fans are a whole other breed of people, and but like not in a bad way, like just how much they care is just like incredible. And like Louis says it best again, like in this independent thing,
yeah,
like he thinks that they're going to write books about One Direction fans because they're so fanatical and the intensity is remarkable. And he just like talks about how he understands how it can be hard for the fans to like fully understand that they're people outside of being in One Direction. And so I feel like that understanding of like the fandom from the artists themselves is like really incredible. So speaking of fans, in our episode next Sunday, we're actually speaking to 3 One Direction experts, super fans of the band who have been around for quite some time. And we're very excited about this conversation just to get viewpoints that are from people who don't necessarily have like Jenna and mine and my experience like working within the music industry. And so just to hear from people who were just fans and like at no point like knew really how things work other than what they've done research on themselves, I think is going to be a really interesting conversation, and I think you guys are going to really, really enjoy it.
So tune in next week for part 3 of our One Direction conversation.
And then come back in 2 months when we talk about them again, because this is never going to stop. Okay, Jenna, it's your turn to give us the band of the week in 30 seconds or less. Are you ready?
Yeah, wait, let me get my timer up. Okay. Count me down.
Ready? 3, 2, 1, go.
All right, this week I would like to present to you a band called American Teeth. We've been talking a lot about pop punk recently, and this is kind of like another new age pop punk artist. We got some big emo anthems. The singer is Elijah Knoll, who's done some solo stuff, and he's working with his producer, Doc Britton. They're just really fun, emo, like pull out the black eyeliner and yell with all your friends music.
Wow, that sounds really good. You're really good at selling artists, whereas every time I do this, I'm just like a cluster of like, they're my favorite. I love them. Listen.
I love it.
We hope that you enjoy this. I hope that you don't hate me for being kind of rude about Liam Payne, but I mean, I'm just worried about that poor soft boy who does not know he is a soft boy.
If you have thoughts, opinions, you want to fight us, you want to also take our survey so we can do more future episodes about One Direction, you can come tweet at us at Sara_Feigin and at Jenna_million. We also have a Twitter account for our Name 3 Songs, which is at Name 3 Songs. So let's talk.
Thanks so much for joining us. This has been Name 3 Songs. Until next time, never let anyone make you feel bad about your favorite band.
And you're never too cool to listen to Harry Styles.
Don't forget to subscribe to be notified when each episode comes out and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps.
If you want to find out more about any of the sources we've referenced in this episode, you can visit name3songs.com.